Hello, I'm Mark Wallace and I'm the tax partner for Walter Wright. We're a firm based in Hadley in Suffolk. This presentation is going to talk through how the CIS VAT reverse charge mechanism applies if you're a subcontractor in the building industry. I've recorded a detailed presentation that talks about how the various rules work, and if you want to have a full resume of all the very detailed points, then I'd refer you to our YouTube site where that presentation part 1 explains the scheme in more detail. So if you're a subcontractor, what do you need to know about the VAT reverse charge? Well, what is it? Well, it's a new way for accounting VAT. If your services are covered by the VAT reverse charge scheme, then in future you won't have to charge your customer VAT on the invoice. Why has it been brought in? Well, it's been brought in to crack down on fraud in the construction industry. And when does it apply? In very simple terms, it applies from the 1st of March 2021. As I say, parts 2 and 3, and this is part 2, explains how to applies if you're a subcontractor, and part 3 explains how it applies if you're a contractor in the construction industry. So, when does it apply? Well, you have to ask yourself some questions, and I've tried to simplify it by just laying out the questions that you ask yourself. So first of all, is the contractor you're working for registered for CIS, or should they be? So you need to ask your contractor whether they're registered for CIS, and if the answer to that is yes, then potentially your services will be covered by this new regime. If not, then you have to charge VAT in the normal way. Question 2, is your customer VAT registered? Now, I would guess that in most cases the answer to that is yes, but you need to make sure that you check that they have a VAT registration number, and HMRC would recommend that you actually check it online on their VAT registration service to check that the number is valid. Again, if your customer is VAT registered, then the VAT reverse charge may apply. If they're not VAT registered, you don't have to do anything more, you just charge VAT in the normal way. Question 3, does the services that you are supplying fall within the scope of CIS? If you're a subcontractor, you will probably be aware that the contractor has to make a report to HMRC and of any services caught within CIS. So if the services you're supplying, which are things like building on a building site, it may be painting internally, it may be decorating, maybe construction, new building, all those sort of services, they are in CIS and therefore has to be dealt with underneath this new scheme. Is the supply that you're supplying reduced or standard rated? So if you're VAT registered, you'll be aware that as a builder, most supplies you charge VAT at the 20% rate. Sometimes, if for example you're working on a conversion of a non-residential building to a residential, you might charge a VAT up to 5%. But there may be cases, for example, working on a new build where the house has been constructed from scratch, that you don't charge VAT at all. If it falls into that last category, i.e. you don't charge VAT because you're applying it at the 0 rate, again the VAT reverse charge doesn't apply and you just carry on regardless. And then finally, question number 5, is the customer an end user? Now there's a lot of details as to what an end user is, but put simply, your customer has to tell you whether or not they are an end user. If they tell you that they're an end user or an intermediary, then you don't apply VAT, the reverse charge, you charge VAT in the normal way. If they do tell you, then the VAT reverse charge rules apply. So having gone through all those 5 questions, if you come to the conclusion that yes, the VAT mechanism, reverse charge mechanism applies because they're registered for CIS, because they're VAT registered, because they're not an end user, and because of the fact that the rules, the suppliers come underneath CIS, if the answer to all those questions apply, then you apply the reverse charge rules. So what are they? How do they work? Well, very simply, in the future you won't charge VAT to your customer. So at the moment, underneath before 1st of March, if a builder was doing building work for a contractor, he would charge VAT on his invoice, and you would pay that VAT over to HMRC when you do your VAT return. Well, from 1st of March, you don't do that. You don't charge VAT. What you do is on your invoice, you still show the VAT that you would have paid to HMRC. So the invoice may well say that VAT at 20% applies, or VAT of 20%, and if, say, for example, it was £10,000 you were charging the customer, you say VAT at 20%, £2,000 applies, but you also say on the invoice that the reverse charge mechanism applies. But what you don't do is you don't actually charge the VAT to the customer, and you don't pay the VAT over to HMRC because you're not charging the customer. You have to make sure that the customer knows that they've got to account for the VAT themselves. So, what do HMRC suggest? Well, they suggest that what you do is on your invoice you put a wording. So, for example, from their guidance, there's 3 wordings suggesting VAT is charged applies, customer to pay VAT to HMRC. They suggest perhaps you put the more technical details on, but whatever it is, you need to put something on your invoices to say that reverse charging applies and that the customer has to pay VAT to HMRC. In fact, there's no legal requirement for you to use any of HMRC's wording. You can use your own wording. And what about when you do your VAT returns? Well, you don't put the VAT in the VAT transaction on your return in any way or shape or form. So you don't put the VAT in box 1, that's outputs, and you don't put VAT in the supplies box, that's the net value of sales, in box 6. You just don't enter the invoice on your VAT return at all. So what should you do? What's our advice? Well, firstly, make sure that your customer is VAT registered. Secondly, make sure they're CIS registered. You need to ask them those questions. You need to look at your contracts and decide if reverse charging applies. And then fourthly, you need to retain evidence if they tell you that they're an end user or they are an intermediary. So what about any other points? Well, if you're a subcontractor and you're in the building industry, you'll be charging VAT, but you'll be reclaiming VAT on all of your expenses. Now, you may find that it's no longer appropriate for you to be on quarterly VAT basis accounting. If you're receiving VAT refunds because you're still incurring expenses and are able to reclaim the VAT in the normal way, then you may want to move to monthly VAT returns. That means that you get your refunds of VAT quicker than you would do on quarterly accounting. If you account for VAT on a cash accounting basis, now what that means is that when you pay an invoice, that's when you reclaim VAT. In the future, you might like to reclaim VAT on when the invoice is received from your supplier. So, for example, if you go down to Jewson's and they send you an invoice, underneath the cash accounting, you would perhaps pay the invoice 2 months later. If you pay the invoice 2 months later, that's the point when you reclaim VAT. Underneath the invoice basis, you reclaim VAT when the invoice is received. That means that you're recovering the VAT quicker, and particularly if you're doing monthly returns, you could receive the VAT from HMRC sooner. If you're on the flat rate scheme, and admittedly there's very few people around who still are, but if you're on the VAT scheme, then I'd recommend that you consider moving off the VAT flat rate scheme. If you think about it, a flat rate person cannot reclaim any VAT on their expenses. And if you're a subcontractor and you're not charging any VAT because the reverse charge doesn't apply, and you don't actually pay over any VAT underneath a flat rate scheme if you're reverse charging applies, that means that effectively there's no point to you being VAT registered. So my recommendation is that you either cancel your VAT registration or you become a VAT registered person in the normal way. There's lots of guidance on HMRC's website. The detailed link is here, and I'll put a note of it on the notes. So thank you very much for listening. As I said, I'm Mark Wallace, and if you wish to contact me to discuss it in more detail, please feel free to contact me at the office at the number on this slide. Thank you.